Yes, so welcome to the Danish Institute of International Studies, where today's event will focus on disarmament as a key tool in the UN's efforts to prevent and mitigate conflict. My name is Maria-Louise Clausen, and I'm a senior researcher here at DIIS. And I'm happy to see a good turnout because for some reason during times of war, the discussion on disarmament tend to disappear. But it is during times of war and conflict that the UN and global commitments to disarmament and arms control are truly put to the test. This has been reflected during the current UN General Assembly meeting, where the Pact of the Future was just approved. A document that the UN describes as a landmark document intended to set the future for the UN and leading to a better world, no less. Disarmament is one of the topics covered and the topic, broadly speaking, of today's event. So, without further ado, I will briefly present today's speakers, who will each give a presentation of approximately 15 to 20 minutes, followed by a discussion with the panel and, of course, you in the audience. First, I'll briefly present Emma Rosengren from the Swedish Institute of International Affairs, who will present on gender and disarmament. She will be followed by Andrea Edoardo Varisco, an associate senior researcher at CIPRI and an independent researcher, who will focus on licit and illicit trade of arms. But our first speaker will be Trine Pejstrup, my colleague here at DIIS, who is the mastermind behind this event and the project that it's part of. She is the co-author of this brief with me, Bridging North-South Disarmament Divides, and the author of this report, Challenges to the Multilateral Disarmament, which she will now present on. But before she does that, I'll just say that both the brief and the report are available for download on the DIIS webpage, and you can, of course, grab copies as you exit the room. And I hope that you will, because you should read them if you haven't already. And finally, on a very practical note, the project is part of a larger group of studies here at DIIS on the UN that aims to provide multidisciplinary, in-depth knowledge on topics related to peace and security, as Denmark prepares for a candidacy in the UN Security Council for 25-26. So that's all I'll say. I will stop wasting your time and give the word to Trine. And you have 15 minutes.
Starting now. Perfect. Thank you so much, Maria. Is the sound okay? Great. All right. Well, disarmament and arms control in times of war. I once had a professor at KU tell me that disarmament and arms control are things to be discussed in times of peace, not war. Now, I would beg to differ. Right now, we are meeting in the midst of both war and rising conflict around the world. Renewed nuclear fright has seen even the citizens of the most peaceful nations prepping in their basements and garages, while arms deliveries to Israel right now is dividing opinions across the EU. So instead of separating disarmament and arms control from discussions of war, their relevance in mitigating peace and conflict are really as present as ever. And today we're going to look to the United Nations for a couple of answers, at least on this. So for decades now, disarmament and arms control have been central to the UN's effort to mitigate peace and conflict. However, multilateral disarmament right now is facing a number of challenges, not to mention renewed focus on nuclear weapons. We also have increasing military spending around the world and technological arms races. So for the past couple of years at least, nuclear states have been hardening their rhetoric around the use and role of nuclear weapons to their national security. And right now, all 9 nuclear-armed states are believed to be or openly expanding and or modernizing their nuclear arsenals. As you can see here, we're also experiencing increasing world military expenditure around the globe. And in 2023, this world military expenditure reached a new high of $2,400 billion. And according to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, this has been increasing since the 1990s, with annual consistent increases since 2015. Now, technological arms races are also placing unprecedented pressure on disarmament and arms control treaties. We're seeing both major military powers as well as alliances like NATO striving to gain what they call the upper hand, technological superiority in areas such as autonomous weapon systems, cyber capabilities, artificial intelligence, quantum technology, you name it. At the same time, disarmament and arms control treaties have, to a large extent, at least over the recent years, been increasingly abandoned, weakened, and neglected by states. As an example, we saw in 2019 the US withdrawing from what is called the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the INF, which was a Cold War agreement between the US and the Soviet Union, later Russia, and that which saw elimination of a lot of missiles and was quite central to Cold War arms control. And when the US withdrew from this, the Trump administration specifically, I was working at the UN Office for Disarmament Affairs in New York that deals with negotiation of treaties, compliance, enforcements, all these areas of multilateral disarmament, and was really, as an intern, only starting to understand what that meant. And I remember the morning in February that they announced the withdrawal, I looked up from my desk as I heard a loud yell coming from a couple of desks across from me. And a male colleague of mine had stood up and slammed his fists into the desk, rushed out of the office, and later told me that his entire career had been dedicated to this one treaty that under this presidency he now saw crumble to pieces. And that to me is an anecdote I would like to share with you today, because it really made it evident for me that there's a human face behind some of the UN policies that are so easy to criticize and so easy to look for holes in as an outsider. But really understanding the heart and soul and the careers that go into this, and also the fragility of these disarmament treaties under political pressure is quite important. So with this context in mind, I set out in this report and the policy brief to really understand, well, what are the key challenges to multilateral disarmament within the UN right now? And after speaking to interviewees from both the Office for Disarmament Affairs and the UN Disarmament Institute for Disarmament Research, International Committee of the Red Cross, and many more that are included in disarmament affairs outside and inside the UN, two critical trends were repeated. The first one is a significant trust deficit between member states. A second one is a declining confidence in multilateral disarmament frameworks, the actual capabilities of the disarmament machinery, as we often call it. Now, while these two trends are not particularly new when we discuss the UN and the challenges that it's facing, these two trends present distinct challenges to disarmament and arms control specifically. They also cut across categories of weapons and disarmament. So today I'm briefly going to talk about them through three examples, being nuclear weapons, conventional weapons, and emerging technologies. On nuclear weapons, the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, also called the NPT, a key non-proliferation and disarmament treaty that obligates signatories, especially nuclear armed states, to engage in negotiations towards nuclear disarmament is facing increasing criticism. As you can see here, as of 2023, the estimated global nuclear warhead inventories of the world are still mainly dominated by the US and Russia. So we have seen the retirement of what we call retired warheads, but still operational warheads are increasing. A national representative from one of the UN member states that I spoke to while in New York doing interviews described to me how non-nuclear states view this treaty, the NPT, as being exploited by the nuclear armed states to maintain a status quo that benefits them rather than actually advancing towards a nuclear-free world. We also see this echoed in recent literature on nuclear disarmament, arguing that the NPT framework really enables nuclear armed states to present themselves as moral, at least responsible actors of international security, while actually continuing to modernize their nuclear arsenals. Now, the trust deficit between member states extends far beyond just nuclear negotiations and treaties to the arena of what we call conventional weapons. Think small arms, fire guns, ammunition, military tanks, even fighter jets. So in 2013, the UN saw the adoption of what is called the Arms Trade Treaty, ATT, and that was adopted both to prevent illicit, illegal trade of arms, but also to set some standards for legal trade of arms, so that states that export a lot of weapons have some standards to who then they sell them to and under what circumstances. So they can assess, are these weapons going to fuel conflict where they end up, or can they be used to violate human rights? And while in New York, I spoke to one of the people that had really driven the campaign of the Arms Trade Treaty. And she told me that a lot of the representatives from the Global South UN member states argued that any efforts towards peace or international security across the world, but especially in the Global South, from their point of view, is compromised without regulation of the global arms industry. One even described peace efforts without arms control as mopping the floors with the taps open. Still today, though, as we can see here, the global trade in arms is dominated by Western states. So while this treaty, the ATT, was broadly signed and it was also broadly supported, major arms exporting countries have been reluctant to or had a hard time really aligning their national laws and practices with the treaty. So there's been quite a big gap between the commitment made on paper and the realities we've seen of arms trade controls. The rapid pace of technological arms races, as I mentioned previously, also has put unprecedented pressure on not only the adaptability of disarmament and arms control treaties, but also their relevance, which has been questioned time and time again. We especially see this right now in debates on emerging technologies in outer space. So increased militarization of outer space through new technological advancements such as anti-satellite weaponry, for example, and the increased use of satellites has really seen some calls, especially from Global South members of the UN, for legally binding measures that can keep larger states accountable to their activities in outer space. And this debate is quite interesting because it highlights a division between the countries that are calling for what we call hard law, legally binding instruments, and soft law, norms, rules, principles for responsible state behavior, in this case in outer space. And this is really evident in two ways. Firstly, many member states are not convinced that the technological advancement we're seeing right now, for example, in an area like outer space, can be met by the binding and legal instruments that the UN has. On the other hand, they're also not convinced that the soft law, the rules and norms that are being advocated for by larger military powers, is done so to do anything but console their own dominance in outer space and make sure that that they keep that, of course. So from this report showing growing distrust between member states, but also a declining confidence in the very capabilities of the disarmament machineries, we have been discussing both in our policy brief and one another, what is then the role of small states in disarmament diplomacy? Increasingly, we're seeing countries from the global south specifically that are pointing to these two key challenges, and they're calling for new approaches, and they are seeking influence on the disarmament agenda. We've also seen that with the Pact of the Future, which was agreed upon last week at the UN. So failure to acknowledge these dynamics can really perpetuate an already existing geopolitical divide and global instability. So Denmark's upcoming tenure at the UN Security Council in 2025, I would argue, presents quite an interesting opportunity for us, not only as a small state, but as a UN member, to play the role of bridging some divides in this disarmament agenda. And we can look to a couple other small states for some inspiration. Norway, for example, has balanced a NATO membership and an active disarmament agenda for a while. In 2022, they were the first country to be an observer at a conference on the ban treaty, which other NATO members have tried not to do. Finland and Sweden right now are in the midst of discussing this very balance themselves. What do we do as NATO members when we also are interested in a disarmament engagement? So it's a very hot topic in other Nordic countries as we speak, and Denmark could really engage in that and really speak to that and consider strengthening that Nordic NATO collaboration. A small state like Denmark also has the opportunity to foster dialogue around these soft law rules and norms. For example, in outer space, we've seen that done by the Netherlands in 2018 with their tenureship at the UN Security Council, where they very successfully pushed for soft law in outer space. So, as a final note, with disarmament and arms control glasses on right now, we're of course looking to the US elections, the upcoming US elections, for a couple of answers on how international cooperation will look in the next couple of years. But the Pact for the Future agreed upon last week and its specific focus on disarmament and arms control really showed that there's a momentum for multilateral disarmament and hope for arms control agreements moving forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Trine. And now I'll give the word to our next speaker, Emma from our neighboring country, Sweden, from which we can surely learn a lot.
And from the sister institute to DIIS, the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. Thank you so much for having invited me. It's really nice to be here, and I'm so excited that you have written this report and this policy brief. I mean, these topics are extremely timely, extremely important, and I'm a big fan of your work, so thank you for that. Do you hear me all right? Great. So in my presentation, I will talk about another topic that is not that often dealt with in times of war and times of conflict, and that is gender. And I will speak about why gender matters when we discuss disarmament, and I'll focus on the integration of a gender perspective in some of the treaties that Trine has actually already introduced. So I hope there is some nice background provided by you, Trine, to what I'm going to discuss as well. But to understand gender and international disarmament treaties, we have to go back to 2000, when the United Nations Security Council adopted Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security. And this resolution kind of centers on three different things. First of all, on the need for women's participation in all matters related to international peace and security. The second one is to protect women and girls from gender-based violence in relation to war and conflict. And the third part is to work preventively to avoid conflict from the beginning. And a further about 9 resolutions have been passed on similar topics related to this Resolution 1325, and together they constitute what is often called the Women, Peace and Security Agenda in international law. So this agenda was the starting point for a lot of work around the world. It was the result of a lot of campaigning with a lot of people organizing within civil society groups, but also a lot of experts in academia and friendly states, as we often call them when we look at international negotiations. And the agenda has been followed by a lot of individual initiatives. For example, Sweden's launch of the feminist foreign policy in 2014 was one effort to continue working on these topics in the national setting. And countries like France, Canada, Mexico, Spain, and Germany have followed Sweden's lead and adopted feminist foreign policies. Now, of course, the Swedish government has abandoned the feminist foreign policy, so we'll see what happens in the future in my home country. But how are issues of women, peace, and security then connected to arms control and disarmament? And that is what I will discuss a bit today. I don't want to get too much into theory, but I wanted to say a few words about a gender perspective and feminist perspectives on international studies. And there's not one feminist approach, not one gender perspective. There are many, and there's a very lively debate in academia, but also elsewhere about what feminism actually means. But one thing that most feminist approaches kind of have in common is an assumption that society is unequal in different ways, and that societies are defined by power structures. And gender is one of the power structures that we have to understand to address inequalities. One example of how gender and power are interlinked is that historically, men have had very disproportionate access to positions of power within states. Even today, just under 27% of the world's parliamentarians are women, and that is a very low number. But research on international relations, on global politics, has largely dealt with great power politics and has thereby focused a lot on the experience of men. So women's experiences of the global is often neglected when we talk about international politics. So a feminist perspective can be to study and to make visible the various experiences that women have from the international. And a very common key question in feminist scholarship is simply asking, where are the women? But a feminist perspective, a gender perspective, can also go beyond the biological categories of men and women and instead focus on how gender affects many different dimensions of international politics, disarmament and arms control being one of them. So gender is about the social understandings around masculinities and femininities, and by looking at gender more than biological sex, feminist scholars have revealed how associations between masculinity, security, and defense has contributed to the mobilization of men in armed forces around the world, but also to the fact that military solutions are often valued higher than other solutions to international problems, such as negotiations. So in an international context marked by inequality, the adoption of Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security can be seen as a very important success. So as I said, behind the resolution were a group of experts, civil society advocates, and also diplomats from different states including the Nordic states, working for this agenda to become real. And one example of how the women, peace and security agenda has actually influenced international politics is the way it has been integrated in other spheres. And disarmament and arms control is one of them. So I mentioned that one important question in feminist research is about asking where are the women in international politics. And disarmament negotiations, the kind of negotiations that Trine talked about, have historically been characterized by a large number of men as negotiators. 76% of the leaders of diplomatic delegations in major disarmament policy bodies were men in 2018. And during the Cold War, which my research is actually primarily about, that number was between 93 and 96% men in disarmament negotiations. Alva Myrdal, a famous Swedish diplomat, whom I, of course, have to mention, was one of the very few women who acted as the head of a state delegation in disarmament negotiations. And weapons and their use has also historically been associated with men and masculinity. So the mandatory conscription policy for men in many countries, including Sweden, has often been described as a place where boys become men. And different weapons categories have varying consequences for men and women, which I will soon describe in a little bit more detail. Despite these various gender dimensions of disarmament, those agreements that have regulated arms have historically ignored gender dimensions of the weapon categories they regulate. But after the adoption of Resolution 1325 and the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, this has begun to change. So in the 2000s, international humanitarian law has taken an increasingly central role in talks about disarmament and talks about arms control. So the Convention Against Cluster Munitions from 2008, the International Arms Trade Treaty, which Trine mentioned, from 2013, and the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the nuclear weapons ban from 2017, all have language related to the Women, Peace and Security Agenda in them. And this is the result of close cooperation between friendly states and civil society organizations who have tried to act as norm makers in the international system. So I'll start with the Cluster Munitions Convention, because this was the first time that Resolution 1325 was actually referred to in disarmament policy agreements. And cluster munitions, they can be described as kind of a collection of explosive submunitions as a larger projectile consisting of a number of smaller bomb-like objects that are spread over a larger area. And a key issue with cluster munitions, which kind of underlines the humanitarian dimension of these weapons, is that they are characterized by a large number of duds, that is, bombs that do not explode when they have been dropped. So they kind of work a bit like landmines in areas where they have been used. While the intended target is not civilians, a large proportion of those affected by these weapons are in fact civilians. And the use of cluster munitions in Ukraine is a contemporary example of how large areas of land are being contaminated by the use of these weapons. And the consequences of cluster munitions, they differ depending on societal positions, such as age and gender. While men and boys are most at risk of dying or of being injured by cluster munitions due to their social and economic roles in societies, women and girls are often indirect victims of these weapons. Due to societal expectations about women's caring roles, it becomes very much up to women to take care of those who fall victim of these weapons when they have been used. In poor areas, it's often girls that are forced to leave schools when families need to save money, or who are married off in the interest of saving money. At the same time, women and girls are also directly affected by the presence of cluster munitions. So in Ukraine, these weapons killed both civilians, both adults and children, who had sought refuge in a kindergarten shortly after Russia's full-scale invasion. And experiences from affected areas also shows that children who find these items think that they are toys and bring them to their homes where they can explode and of course cause a lot of injury. And since it's usually men who negotiate peace treaties and who decide on efforts to clear unexploded munitions, many of the places where women actually act in societies are neglected or forgotten when plans are made to clear areas from these explosives. So for these reasons and for other reasons, the Convention on Cluster Munitions refers to Resolution 1325 and the need for age and gender appropriate support for the victims of cluster munitions, including the social and economic inclusion aspects. So the convention is quite brief. The language on gender is not super strong, but it is still the first time that international treaties on disarmament and arms control make references to these kind of issues. And this was 8 years after the passing of Resolution 1325. And through the work on cluster munitions, the international community kind of got access to a new kind of vocabulary. They got aware of the gender dimensions of armament and disarmaments. So when the Arms Trade Treaty was negotiated, gender issues were actually very central in negotiations and in discussions about these weapons. So the international trade with arms has for a very long time been extremely unregulated. And this especially applies to the trade of what we usually call small arms and light weapons. That is, weapons that can be handled by 1 to 2 people. Given that these are the most used weapons in wars and conflicts, and given their deadly consequences in both types of peace and of war, they are sometimes referred to as the true weapons of mass destruction. So like cluster munitions, weapons covered by the Arms Trade Treaty have important gender dimensions, not least small arms and light weapons. So again, even though a majority of armed violence actually affects men, it has a very disproportionate impact on women's lives. Small arms are used to threaten and to murder women, to carry out sexualized violence in both war and in peace, and to prevent women from leaving violent relationships. In conflicts, rape is often likened to a weapon that is used to both humiliate, to punish, and to insult the enemy. Weapons enable these kinds of systematic violence, both in war and in peace. During the COVID-19 pandemic, when people were prevented from leaving their homes, deadly armed violence against women in the home actually increased. So while men are most likely to be the victims on the battlefield or on the streets, women are mostly affected in their homes. So when the International Arms Trade Treaty was negotiated, it was not obvious from the beginning that all weapon categories would be included. So the inclusion of small arms and light weapons in the treaty was actually a great success to make these gendered consequences visible. And the introduction to the Arms Trade Treaty highlights that women and children are particularly affected by war and conflict, and the operational part, and this is what's interesting about this treaty compared to the Cluster Munitions Convention, that gender is included in the operational paragraph. So states have to assess if there is a risk that arms exports will be used to facilitate gender-based violence before actually agreeing on the export. finally, and I'm trying to be brief now since I don't have that much time, the Women, Peace and Security Agenda and Resolution 1325 has also reached the weapons category that has basically dominated talks on disarmament and arms control since Hiroshima and Nagasaki were devastated by the US bombings in 1947 and 45, and that is nuclear weapons. So Trine mentioned the non-proliferation treaty, which prohibits the proliferation of nuclear weapons to states other than those that actually had them when the treaty was negotiated, and obliged nuclear weapon states to negotiate disarmament. Even though we have these kind of regulations already, nuclear weapons continue to threaten all of humankind on an everyday basis. The fear that leaders like Vladimir Putin will use nuclear weapons, or that nuclear weapons will be used by accident, that we will not any longer be lucky, as a French scholar, Benoît Pelopidas, has shown that luck is like a very central reason for why nuclear weapons have not been used. This continues to be broadcasted in media and said by experts. So nuclear weapons also have important gender dimensions. When they are used, whether by bombing or by testing, because nuclear weapons testing is also one kind of use, radioactive waste is released and stored in people's bodies. And medical research has shown that a higher proportion of women than men who are exposed to radiation suffer from cancer. It is also shown that women's reproductive capabilities are affected by various uses of nuclear weapons. And at the same time, societal links between masculinity, power, and nuclear weapons possession continue to make these weapons sought after, and this has often stood in the way for disarmament negotiations. So in July 2017, a majority of UN member states adopted the nuclear weapons ban, which Trine mentioned, and the text highlights the special consequences of nuclear weapons for women and girls and the need for women's participation in all work on these issues. And like the Cluster Munitions Convention, it also speaks about victim assistance to women and girls. So just very shortly, some concluding reflections on what I have said. I have used Security Council Resolution 1325 to show how language from that resolution has integrated into other fields of international cooperation, specifically disarmament and arms control. There are some problems, however, with the treaties I have mentioned, and one is that they do not have universal accession. Neither Russia nor the United States has signed the Cluster Munitions Convention or the Arms Trade Treaty, and none of the nuclear weapon states have signed the nuclear weapons ban. Denmark, Norway, and Sweden have acceded to both the Cluster Munitions Convention and the Arms Trade Treaty, but not the nuclear weapons ban. And Finland has only signed the Arms Trade Treaty, not the Cluster Munitions Convention, and not the nuclear weapons ban. So these treaties lack universal adherence, but they cannot still not be seen as completely meaningless. The knowledge production that has been produced in negotiations of these treaties have given us a lot of information. So if we want to clear areas from mines and explosive devices, we need to be aware of how gender affects access to different kind of places to make sure that we get rid of weapons everywhere. And research on norms also shows that international treaties can have normative consequences, even for those states that have not signed them. The Landmines Convention from '97 is one example of how norms have actually developed from these kind of treaties. In the interest of time, I think I will stop there, and I look forward to discussing these issues with you all later on. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, and we will hurry on. You will stand on the other side. So our final speaker, Andrea from Also an associate senior researcher at SIPRI, another Swedish sister institute to the Danish Institute. You also have 20 minutes.
Hear me? Does it work? Yeah, perfect. Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me. My name is Andrea Varisco. I'm associate senior researcher at SIPRI and independent consultant. It's a pleasure for me to be here and talk about licit and illicit trade of conventional arms and its instruments of control, or the try to control, I would say. So I will look at some of the topics that we raised today through the lenses of conventional arms, mostly small arms and light weapons. This is more or less what we will talk about. First, I'll have a very quick introduction of what conventional arms are, how many of them are transferred and exported and imported. Then we will look at the other side of the coin, the illicit trafficking part. We look briefly at some arms control instruments. I will try to conclude back to the challenges of disarmament and arms control in times of war, which is the topic of today. So first, what conventional arms are, for those who are not familiar, is basically everything that is not chemical, biological, or nuclear. These are the different categories. Emma already mentioned them. They are UN ROCA, that is a register of conventional arms. So they go from aircraft to small arms and light weapons. I will look into that in a second. And here the famous quote where Kofi Annan compared small arms and light weapons to weapons of mass destruction for the consequences that they have. When it comes to the type of market that we're looking at, how much money do they move? The revenues of the largest producers of conventional arms is around 597 billion in 2022. These are data from SIPRI. If we look at the market, it's primarily, as you can imagine, a Western-led market with some exception, the usual suspects though, China and Russia. This is also because the technology to produce some of the conventional arms is not so widespread in the world. When it comes about transfers, these are data from the SIPRI Arms Transfer Database. I directed that research program for 1 year. If we look at the global trade, it had a drop more or less after the end of the Cold War, and now it's rising again. Again, when we look at exports, here we're talking about major wars, major arms, as SIPRI defined them. Basically, they are all categories of conventional arms except small arms and light weapons. Again, a market primarily dominated by US and Western countries, plus Russia and China, but more producers than the conventional arms side. And when it comes to imports, these are the regions that have imported the most, with some differences between these 5 years and the other 5 years. You see Europe, of course, increasing the number of imports. You can easily imagine why. And again, who are the main importers? Here we have other states: India, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Ukraine and Pakistan. So this is to show how globalized and interrelated is this trade. When it comes about small arms and light weapons, Emma already provided a very quick definition. Small arms are basically those that can be carried by one person. Light weapons more than one person. And this is the actual UN definition. Measuring the trade of small arms and light weapons is more difficult, but it has been estimated at around 7 billion per year by UNODA. And in terms of numbers, it's more than 1 billion firearms in the world. I guess we are now 8 billion of inhabitants. And when I started working, I thought, oh, that's too much. Then I start thinking about my people I knew. Someone maybe working, they went to the army, someone working for the police, someone hunting. And it was like, okay, yeah, we're getting close. And then if you imagine that some countries have a higher rate of weapons for pro capita, here is where you get to this number. This was the, let's say, the legal part, the trade part. What is illicit trafficking? And why, usually in this presentation, I come from legal to illegal? Because someone has defined it as good trade gone bad. So illicit is contrary to the norms of national and international law, and most of the times, illicit arms, when it comes to conventional arms, are mostly small arms alloy weapons for several reasons. They are cheaper, they are easier to carry, easier to conceal, easier to move, etc. So this is one of the reasons why most of the illicit arms are small arms alloy weapons. And here I have to introduce very quickly a concept of diversion. The concept of diversion, which for those who are not familiar with, is despite there is not an international agreed definition of diversion, there have been some different definition, but it's basically a weapon that becomes illicit, that ends up in the hands of an unauthorized end user. So there have been different type of definitions. What has been agreed, or at least shown in some of these international instruments, is that arms can become illicit and be diverted at every stage of their life cycle and transfer chains. This is true. I used to work for an organization that tracked and traced weapons from conflict, so back to manufacturers, trying to understand where they became illicit. In my experience, because we were working on conflict, the vast majority were diverted after delivery, so post-shipment type of diversion. Of course, this is on my experience. If probably you talk with a person working in customs, he will say completely the opposite, say no, everything happens during transfers, a lot of diversion happens there. But this is from my experience. So a manufacturer, here is a photo of me 10 years ago or so, at the border between India and Nepal, making photos of some craft weapons. So craft production and illicit manufacture is one of them. And then I know that the report talks also about new technologies, and this is one issue in the small arms at least field, particularly 3D printed type of small arms. So additive manufacture and new technologies are one example. On transfer, here I provide a very brief example of 200 tons of small arms alloy weapons and ammunition that were meant to reach Nigeria. I say they were meant because the end user certificate, which is basically a paper that is part of the transaction, of the licensing transaction, indicated Nigeria as an end user, and then they ended up in Liberia back in 2002 when Liberia was experiencing a war. After export, this is a report I had the pleasure to work on and contribute for the analytical part. It basically looked at the origin of all the weapons, or most of the weapons, that were captured from Islamic State for 3 years. And one example was, this one is ATGW, anti-tank guided weapons. This was exported from a European state to the US in December 2015 or 2014, sent to a Syrian group, captured by Islamic State, recaptured, and documented by colleagues in the field. All this 2 months. In 2 months, just to tell you the pace of how quick weapons are diverted in conflict. But this is not, I mean, of course, this is an interesting story, but there are other aspects. If we look at the data of all the weapons, you see that the wide majority is 40%, so 50-60% of the total comes from weapons that are from 1970 to 1999. 1990, and they were used in 2015, 16. Just to tell you the life cycle of weapons, how weapons remain active and usable even 30, 40 years after. And then around 10% of the weapons had this small triangle with this incision. This means that they were part of the Saddam army stockpiles. So 10% were coming from the Iraqi army, or they were at one point in their life chain in possession of the Iraqi forces. And that doesn't only mean Iraqi manufactured weapons, but also imported weapons. This one, for instance, is a Russian one. So there are different ways in which weapons can be diverted or become illicit. Loss from state stockpiles, cases of state collapse, we've seen Afghanistan recently. Cases of state-sponsored diversion in conflict situation, we have seen some recently. Battlefield capture and surpluses and post-conflict surpluses. Here again, back 10 years ago or so, you see all those ammunition are bent. I was in South Sudan, and we're documenting those, and they told from the army of South Sudan, they were captured from a rebel group they were fighting against. And they were saying that they are all banned because they airdropped them and because Sudan was sending them. And what was interesting is that, so we took the photo. You see here, you have one is the lot number, 39 is the caliber, 14 was the year of manufacture. And this is a Sudanese head stamp. It's a back of the ammunition. 2014 means production in 2014, and the conflict started in 2013, and there were allegations of these rebels being supported by Sudan. So this was kind of a, not necessarily the smoking gun, but quite an important data point. So we've seen there are different risks of diversion in the supply chain. And this is a publication from the Small Arms Survey of a few years ago. And to conclude this part, I will say that there are different ways in which weapons can become illicit and different enabling factors as well. What are interesting to me are two things. One is trying to understand the different sources, because one problem might have one type of solution, another problem might have another type of solution. This is what we try to do in a paper I co-authored at CIPRI a few years ago. And sometimes these solutions are not necessarily at national level, they are a regional level, they are an international level. And this brings me actually to the next part of the presentation on the instruments that try to regulate particularly illicit arms and small arms and light weapons. So if we look at the arms control instruments in this small subset of weapons, most of them or some of them started or were discussed and negotiated 20 years or so ago. The Firearms Protocol, the Program of Action on Small Arms and Light Weapons. There's just been the review conference last June. The International Tracing Instrument, which is basically a relative of the Program of Action. The mechanisms go together. The Arms Trade Treaty, as we have said, is of 10 years ago, and very recently there has been the discussion and the passing of the Global Framework for True Life Conventional Ammunition. Very quickly on those instruments, the Firearms Protocol is linked to a Convention Against Transnational Crime, as it has some positive aspects. One of them is a legally binding instrument. It requires mark and register for 10 years. The limitations is a bit on the definition. It looks at firearms, not necessarily small arms and light weapons. And if you look at the website and look at the ratifications, there are a few states quite, I would say, quite relevant from a global perspective that are outside of this protocol. The UN Programme of Action on Small Arms and Live Weapons was negotiated 25 years ago. It has different measures at different level and speaks also about cooperation and assistance, dialogue, and there are different mechanisms of revision. Back to personal experiences. I started this career in 2006. I was doing an internship at the UN during the RevCon, the first RevCon. RevCon means review conference of the program of action, and the states couldn't find an agreement on some aspects of the final text. So to say that these are difficult processes sometimes. It's a politically binding agreement, and it goes from through consensus. So it's not always the more high in terms of level and threshold that can be found. The international tracing instruments looks at tracing and sets some of the main points in management of small arms and live weapons. There are marking, tracing, and record keeping, and these are the more operational ones. Again, it's politically binding. And the Arms Trade Treaty, we have seen, it looks at the two sides of the coin. First, regulating the licit trade, and then prevent and eradicate the illicit trade. Again, there have been not universal membership and some compliance critiques, particularly recently, but also in the past. And the global framework for ammunition has just been adopted. The first meetings will be in next year and in 2027. If we look at those instruments, and I will skip very quickly here, diversion and illicit trafficking are in all these instruments. UN Firearms Protocol, but also the ITI, the Global Framework of Ammunition, the ATT is in the preamble, and the Arms Trade Treaty has some obligations on regulating the weapons. One of them is risk assessment that also include Article 7.4, looking at potential problems related to gender-based violence. And there have been some efforts also to counter diversion. One of them is the creation of a closed group when states can discuss cases of diversion. There have been some measures that, there are to some extent preventive, during transit, post-delivery. I invite you to have a look at the work on post-shipment controls that has been done by CIPRI, basically controls after a transfer of the weapons that states that are exporting weapons can put in place. And what is the goal of those measures when diversion happens? The goal will be to exchange information, and that the information can actually feed a risk assessment and have a sort of warning system that goes back this used in future risk assessment. I have 2 slides and 1 minute and a half, I guess. So I'll try to be very brief. I have three main points. In times of war, which is the topic of today's conversation, we have seen how in actual conflict is sometimes difficult to monitor weapons, but not impossible. We don't talk, I guess, today about UN embargoes, but also in this case there have been some difficulties. But the way to do so is through the implementation of some measures that are in these instruments that we talk about. So marking, tracing, record keeping, the things I show you were able because there have been instruments that look at those things and prescribe those. I know that your great report also talks about emerging technologies. As mentioned, the small arms and live weapons is an issue on the table that has been discussed recently at the RevCom of the POA. I invite you to read a paper that we wrote. It's on the problems related to manufacture, but also to transfer. And then for the 2 points that I wrote here, they are concluding points of your report: the trust deficit between states and the decreasing confidence in the UN disarmament machinery. I just concluded I work with the Small Arms Survey on looking at the reasons why Indo-Pacific states are not in the Arms Trade Treaty in terms of membership, because it's a region with very low level of membership. And some of the issues they raised are those that you also raised in the report. Domestic reservations, fear that the treaty can stop their capacity to import weapons, but also skepticism or compliance issues. Why are you asking us to enter into a treaty where states there are actually not respecting it? And then there are others, among them need for political momentum, so raise awareness, geopolitical concerns. India is not on board, Pakistan is not on board, Indonesia is not on board, so for small states it's more difficult. Limited capacity, and another final point, competing national priorities. When we look at Oceania, they told us, we have a very small level of trade, not a lot of cases. Climate change is our real priority, not necessarily arms trade. So trying to look and understand more. I conclude here. I leave some sources for those who are interested, and yeah, I conclude here. I think I went a bit overboard. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Can I ask all the panelists to join me? I'll actually just give the floor to myself first, just because I work on the Middle East geographically, and I won't ask you to solve that, but I am curious to follow up on this once-in-a-generation meeting, the Pact of the Future, and I was wondering. As I said, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres called the pact the first recommitment to multilateral nuclear disarmament in a decade. So can you say a little bit, perhaps, of how you evaluate the Pact of the Future, or how you see the future for disarmament and in these times that we are in, just to get us started? I don't know, Trine?
Yeah. Definitely. So thank you both for very interesting inputs and presentations. I think on the one hand, the Pact for the Future is a great step ahead. It's always nice to see UN member states agree, especially when disarmament and arms control is quite central to that agreement. However, it is also quite vague, and possibly also part of why it has been easy to agree upon. So as I mentioned in the last part of my presentation, of course it provides a little bit of momentum for the disarmament and arms control discussions, and it places UN member states' support behind disarmament engagement. But we'll have to see what the actual actions further on are. I know that the Secretary General is very keen on revitalizing disarmament, as he calls it himself. So there is definitely momentum, at least within the UN, but also strong forces outside of the UN moving away from disarmament. So positive, but also skeptical, I would say.
Anyone else cares to join in while you can think of more questions to ask?
I can continue if you want. Thank you, Trine, for being a bit positive. I mean, disarmament is extremely important. We know from history that states are actually able to talk to each other when things seem to be pretty bad. So it is, I mean, extremely important to have different initiatives on this topic. At the same time, I mean, talking now about the nuclear field, where the nuclear threat seems to have reappeared in many ways. When I started, and I spoke to Thomas, who's in the audience, about this over lunch, when I started doing my PhD in 2012, people were shocked. Like, why do you want to write a dissertation about nuclear weapons and nuclear disarmament? Do they even exist any longer? And now we're in a completely new situation. It's like, oh, you work on nuclear issues. That's trendy, which that wasn't the case a bit more than 10 years ago. So things do change all the time, but there is this very big frustration in the nuclear disarmament community that the nuclear weapon states have failed to live up to any of their commitments to actually negotiate nuclear disarmament in good faith. And that is something I think they will have to show some real initiative to make countries, governments across the globe kind of believe in the possibility to do something progressive in the future. And the nuclear ban that both you and me mentioned, Trine, is an example of how states that do not have nuclear weapons have actually organized to put pressure on nuclear weapon states to do something. And I think we will see a lot more of this kind of frustration in the coming years.
Want to add anything, Andrea, or to anyone in the audience?
To the pact of the future, but look a bit at the future of arms control and disarmament, let's say. And I look it from the small angle of the Arms Trade Treaty that just passed 10 years, but it's a legally binding instrument. Again, it's a mixed, I would say, a mixed position and mixed evaluation of what happened, because if we look at this treaty, first it tried to set a level playing field where all states try to abide by the same type of rules, and it had in 10 years reached 115 different states. So this is positive, and also, as Emma was saying, those norms are also having an influence on other states that are not part of the treaty. So trying to move toward a common type of regulations, or at least articles that need to be taken into consideration. But then if we look at who is in, who is out, the US unsigned the treaty, so left. China is part of it, but the main exporters are, except from the US and Russia. The main importers are not, and there have been, of course, the text is crafted in a way where you have some obligations, some prohibitions, but also some leverage in terms of risk assessment, and therefore there have been questions about what have been seen as example of limited compliance with those treaties, and no enforcement mechanism to make states accountable, at least. So, thank you.
I mean, I think the thing with the lack of enforcement mechanisms is a bit of a challenge. I don't know if you have anything else you want to say, otherwise I'll go to a question from the audience. Yeah. So we have man with a green shirt.
Thank you. I'm Richard McCormack, the man with the green shirt. I'm from the Danish Refugee Council. I've got two questions, if it's okay. The first is on the idea of nuclear disarmament and really whether it's dead in the water. It rests on the concept of deterrence, which was almost in the world of being debunked only a few years ago. And now, arguably, there's a real case at hand where the West has been deterred in putting no-fly zones into Ukraine and so forth. So deterrence works. So does that not effectively kill efforts on universalization of a nuclear weapons ban? The second question I've got is you touched on in your introductory discussion on Denmark's upcoming seat in the Security Council and the role that small states can play, and pointed at Norway and Norway's role in disarmament affairs whilst being a NATO state. Another example might be Ireland and the progress that Ireland made on the political declaration on explosive weapons in populated areas. How confident is the panel that Denmark actually is going to take a leading role in disarmament affairs in the Security Council? Denmark didn't have a disarmament ambassador for a number of years. I personally watched states applaud Denmark's completion of stockpile destruction of cluster munitions, and they stood up and applauded an empty chair that said Denmark on it. Then we have the rather lackluster response to the US transfer of cluster munitions to Ukraine, where I think the line was, in general, we discourage, and it didn't go beyond that. Actually, it was nothing at all. So is Denmark really going to play any sort of meaningful role like other small states in this, or is it just lip service? Thank you.
Thank you. I think maybe we will just take those two questions. They were both excellent questions, and then I'll follow up with a round where we'll take, I think, 3 questions. But take the 2.
I can start with the lip service.
And then I can continue with deterrence.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, so confidence is there, but of course a bit low. What I would be hoping for is that the momentum we are seeing in the Nordic countries at the moment, this discussion that I touched upon on the balance between NATO membership and an active disarmament engagement, at least just a disarmament engagement, can be used to some kind in the Security Council tenureship. But we'll have to see if the MFA picks up on that and if they agree. But some of the things that can be easy to push upon at least and well applauded in the UN would be areas such as soft law on outer security. That's not too dangerous to touch on. Small and arms and light weapons as well, especially if we're talking illicit trade. Of course, we've seen some rather disappointing mentions, as you say yourself, on cluster munitions, and Denmark has not shown any teeth at all in their public discussions or announcements on what the official feeling around cluster munitions to Ukraine has been. So again, I'm trying to stay positive and say that there could be an opportunity for Denmark to use that disarmament momentum at the moment. And we've also seen, so the UN Security Council campaign of Denmark is touching a lot upon giving a voice, as they call it, to the Global South members of the UN. And my argument exactly is that if you say you're going to do that, disarmament and arms control has to be a central part of that. There's no getting around that. So it's going to be difficult to stay on that path that they've laid out themselves for this tenure and not touch upon any aspect of disarmament or arms control.
Yes, thank you, man in the green shirt. Sorry, I don't remember your name. For your point on deterrence. And I mean, does deterrence work? I guess the answer depends on where on the theoretical spectrum you position yourself. And this is something that has been debated for years and years, and I'm sure you're aware of that. I would say that, I mean, to me, the most important question is not if it works or not. It is, are we brave enough to live with the consequences of the various uses of nuclear weapons, ranging from, uranium mining to nuclear testing and to the risk that nuclear weapons will be used by mistake. So if you read Benoît Pilopida's work on luck and how luck has actually saved the world from devastation throughout the nuclear age, then I mean I don't want to rely on luck for the world to continue existing. And I don't want to rely on deterrence either, because that is based on notions of fear, which I guess is not that constructive. So does it work in some cases? I'm sure it does. I mean, many smart people have thought about deterrence as a really, really great security strategy. There are good reasons for that. But it's also associated with so many risks.
Great. I have 3 people now, so I'll take all 3 of you. And please do, as our friend in the green shirt did, briefly introduce yourself. So, person in the back first.
Thank you. So I'm Jakob Didriksen from the Danish Defense College Institute of Military Technology. So first of all, thank you to all 3 presenters for really fascinating presentations, and also DIIS for convening this event. So my question goes to the second presenter, Dr. Rosengren, I think it was. Seeing that Lithuania has recently withdrawn from the Cluster Munition Convention, have you done any research into, the debate surrounding their withdrawing, and especially whether, gender perspectives played any role in them contemplating staying or leaving the convention, and also the, remaining state parties and how they try to encourage Lithuania to stay on board? Thank you.
Thank you. And the next one is the person on the stripe.
Hi, thanks all of you for this presentation. I'm Thomas Fraise, I'm a postdoc at Copenhagen University. And I have two questions. The first is for Emma. So it's just a general question about we saw the rise of conservative and reactionary forces around the world with usually very clear anti-feminist discourses. And I was wondering if you'd seen a noticeable effect on the inclusion of gender in the negotiation or even the general discourses, or if it is now set and it's not likely to bulge, at least a certain understanding of gender. And the second question, I think, is for the two other speakers. It's more a question of curiosity, but you mentioned the fact that in the Indo-Pacific, many countries felt climate change was the more pressing issue for them, more than arms trade. And I was thinking about Nita Crawford's recent book on Pentagon and climate change, and how the Pentagon is one of the world's biggest emitter of CO2, and whether there existed or whether there was room for initiatives that could link the two and bring those countries into the question. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And we'll take the last one from the gentleman in the front.
My name is Tue Magnussen, and I'm a member of the Danish UN Association's Council for Disarmament and Peace. In fact, I have 4 small points, so I'll make it very briefly. But before taking those, I would thank you for very good presentations, but I have to concentrate especially on Trine's, because all my questions are dealing with the UN Treaty on ban of nuclear weapons. The first is, in fact, this question raised on the Pact for the Future. I think you should notice that there's a big step backwards, because exactly the treaty of banning nuclear weapon is not mentioned. And that is in contradiction to at least statements of the General Secretary, Antonio Guterres, in other contact. Then I have been very glad to read both the policy brief here, and this is especially because of that to Trine. But I'm not quite sure that I agree with all you are writing, especially on page 2. You write, although Denmark's NATO membership prevents ratification of the Treaty of the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons then and then. But my point is, I think that there's no documentation either here nor in the book that this should be the case. There have been published in Norway a very interesting report which argue that the Atlantic Treaty is not in contradiction to the treaty. And that leads me also to your book. Now I have a lot of things to be clear on. On page 22, find it here. You're telling that Denmark have said that one reason to be against the TPNW is that it's undermining Article 6 of the NPT, which addresses nuclear disarmament. I have tried to look on the position of the Danish government, and there was a debate in the parliament in January 21. It was not mentioned there. In other statements of different ministers of foreign affairs, it has not been mentioned. So what is the source for your writing? And then on 23, and that's the last one, you are telling that at the when the ban treaty entered into force in January 2021 with the approval of 122 nations. That was not the case. That was the people when it was adopted by the UN General Assembly and not when it came into force. But that leads me to the very last additional question. Now the number of nations who have ratified, member states who have ratified the treaty have just gone up to 73. But could you give a good explanation why it's so little 7 years after the treaty was adopted by UN?
Thank you.
Thanks.
You can pick and choose an answer as you please from the whatever direction you
I can
prefer.
start with DIIS. Thank you so much, Tua, and thank you for thoroughly reading the report. I'm happy that that someone is doing that. So first on, and I think that touches on the first three of your comments, at least two of them. The source of that is the MFA themselves. So that's what they've been telling me when I've been in discussions with them around these matters, their specific stand on the ban treaty. So I'm not sure if that has not been mentioned in specific speeches, but at least that is the source. Yes, the MFA. We can discuss that afterwards. Yeah. Yes, and then I'm not an expert on the TPNW specifically. So why there has not been more movement, I guess it is exactly as you say yourself. They believe that it goes against the commitment made in the NPT, and I don't think there's been much movement towards the TPNW from members who weren't in the very early starts supporters of that for those exact reasons. But I can't go into specifics on each country. I don't know that much about it to do that. But I'm happy to discuss the sources with you afterwards. Oh yes, and then I had a comment on the CO2 emissions of military, not only operations, but armament, arms trade, and so forth. There's been some really interesting recent research done on that. So I think there's more and more attention placed on that. And especially when we're talking Indo-Specifics, it's difficult to see those two things, not only with arms trade and CO2 emissions of arming up of major military powers, but also nuclear testing and the use of nuclear weapons and that connection to climate catastrophe. So there's a major link to be made between the disarmament agenda and the climate change agenda. So thank you for flagging that. Maybe you can speak a bit more to that, Emma.
I can say something about the Danish position on the TPNW and the MPT, which you raised. Thank you for a very important comment. I think that the Danish position is very similar to the Finnish position. This was like one of the key arguments in Finland, that the TPNW would actually put the MPT at risk, mostly because it's not supported by the nuclear weapons state. And this is a very pragmatic approach that Finland has endorsed since the 60s, basically. In Sweden, it was a bit differently, because the foreign minister at that time, Margot Wallström, she wanted Sweden to join the TPNW. This caused an intense debate in Sweden. It's not often that we have debates on these issues in Sweden, but it happened. At that time, it was not as intense as the Swedish nuclear weapons debate in the 50s, but anyways, there was some debate. And those who didn't want Sweden to join the TPNW also described the TPNW as in conflict of some kind with the NPT, with commitments under the NPT. It's not a matter if this logic makes sense. It's just the argumentation, I guess, by various governments, which were similar across the Nordic countries. So I think it makes a lot of sense what you say, Trine, and it's again not evaluating whether it was good or bad. It's just like what they said. And then on Lithuania, I'm not an expert on the withdrawal from the Cluster Munitions Convention, but thank you for a very good research idea. Maybe that's something I can look into a bit further along the way. And also just want to mention, I think they're called the Cluster Munitions Convention. They monitor the implementation and also withdrawal from the convention. They have a lot of good information on their website. So that's possibly a way to look for more information. And then on Thomas Frey's point about conservative trends, I mean, when you ask your question, I immediately start to think about some of the different UN bodies working on women's issues, gender issues, women's human rights. For example, the Commission on the Status of Women and similar fora. I know that in the past 10 years there have been like hesitation to actually sign new documents because there is an awareness that if we write something new, it will be less progressive than it was in the past. So conservative trends have direct consequences for how these issues are being discussed. And I think this is something Andrea might be able to talk a bit more in depth about. But when the Arms Trade Treaty was negotiated, it was quite fascinating to follow how like conservative trends also interfered with the way the treaty was drafted. So some states were really, really keen on having gender language in the treaty to write about gender-based violence and etc. Whereas some more conservative parties, not even parties, is the Vatican considered a state party? No, it's just an observer in these negotiations. Together with Iran and Saudi Arabia, teamed up and said, no, we're not going to talk about gender because that, could make you think about homosexuality or other things. But we can write about women. And this is also one example of how conservative trends are, influencing negotiations in different ways, and how important it is to be specific about language. So we have the gender language in the treaty in the end, but that was like a struggle that states like Ireland decided to take on.
Very briefly, if I can. Yes, indeed, and gender was one of the yearly topics a few years ago, and you always have some countries that are trying to push not just the language, but also the actual implementation of that small article, but important 7.4 as part of the risk assessment. But the same kind of dynamics, you see them also in other instruments where you have some states constantly pushing against the language, and then those dynamics in the room. Very quickly on the question of Thomas about climate change, I was referring specifically to, the study was done on the so-called Indo-Pacific that spans in the definition of the report 40 countries, basically between Pakistan to the most eastern Pacific island state, I think is Samoa or Western Samoa. That issue on, some countries say that arms and security is not necessarily our top priority, and in different regions, different countries gave different answers. For the Oceania and Pacific Island states, one of their main priorities is, of course, climate change. And what is important is that sometimes these officials or these agencies are understaffed, which means that in the same portfolio of the same person, there's arms trade treaty, conventional arms, but also climate change. And it's like, where is my political priority here? And at the same time, you have some regional bodies like the Pacific Island Forum that was active back 20 years ago or so in the security field, but less active now. So you don't even have this kind of push. And in one case, I remember one representative saying, if you can bring those aspects within the security elements related to climate change, this is a way for us to proceed also in disarmament of conventional arms, which for them is not I mean, doesn't imply a lot of weapons that move across their borders. It's like a few dozens. And anyway, there's an ongoing discussion on, I mean, CO2 emission is very interesting, but also the consequences of destruction of, buildings, the environmental consequences of it that you see in Ukraine, but also in Gaza, etc. And there is an effort, at least, to look into those aspects and try to link it with those arms control and security aspects. Also, in terms of increasing climate change, increasing temperatures, what effects they might have in terms of unplanned explosions of materials in large caliber ammunition that can explode, etc. So what kind of stockpile measures can be put in place to try to understand what's coming in terms of climate change. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We are at minus 2-3 minutes, depending on which clock you look at. So would you join me in thanking our 3 speakers? And also thank you to you, the audience, for joining us today for this really important event, I say. And please grab a report and or brief as you leave. Thank you.
Gott, ja.